Many of the most beloved and influential books ever written were published in the 20th century, so I want to talk about some of my favourites. Here are 10 must-read modern classics of the 20th century. I'll start off strong with An Artist of the Floating World by my favourite author of all time, Kazuo Ishiguro. This book was published in 1986 and it stands tall as one of the great books of the 20th century. This is the novel that kind of cemented Kazuo Ishiguro's themes. The ideas, the characters, the archetypes that he likes to explore over and over again in his literature. And since Ishiguro was born in Japan and lived there until he was 5, his first 2 novels were set in his homeland. And An Artist of the Floating World tells the story of an artist who was once a legend of his craft. But during World War II, he was recruited to create propaganda posters for the Japanese Empire, and when the empire fell at the end of the war, his art, his work, the things that had come to define him, as well as his own personal politics and attitude, they all became kind of soured in the eyes of everyone around him. And this is a novel about change, about progress, seen through the eyes of someone who is struggling to accept that change. A man of the old world trying to understand what the new world is going to be and what his place is within it. It's a beautiful book about a very, very flawed protagonist that you feel a lot of sympathy for, even though he is damaged and quite unlikable. It's also a book of twists and turns, and we learn more about him as the book goes on. Ishiguro is very good at creating unreliable narrators and sympathetic, troubled, busted up people. And this is an exemplary piece of fiction, one of the great books of the 20th century. Next, I want to talk about the works of Franz Kafka, another absolute favourite of mine. I've talked about Kafka before. I love his philosophy, I love his sense of humour, and I love how kind of pathetic Kafka was as a person, and how that pathetic behaviour kind of came through in his stories and his novels. I adore everything that he's written, but obviously his most famous book is The Trial. The Trial tells the story of a man who is arrested, and he doesn't understand why, and the book takes him from place to place. He's passed over from hand to hand, from authority to authority. He doesn't understand what's going on. And that's the point of everything Kafka ever did. His books are about bureaucracy. His books are about people who cannot live, or at least struggle to live, within an overly complicated, needlessly bureaucratic, dehumanizing capitalistic society. That's what he did. That's what all of his stories are about, and The Trial is kind of exemplary in that way. Joseph K. doesn't understand why he's on trial. He doesn't know what he did. It's all kept from him. And that frustration is metaphorical, as again is everything that he wrote. The lack of transparency, the lack of fairness within bureaucratic capitalistic systems drove Kafka mad. I find that there's a bleak, dark, pathetic sense of humour to his works that I absolutely love, while, as an anti-capitalist myself, agreeing with everything he wrote. I love Kafka. With my bones, with my blood, I love everything that he did, everything he was. And if you've never read him, read The Trial. And also, obviously, read Metamorphosis, his other most famous work. Kafka was a legend of the early 20th century. Someone who was never appreciated in his time and died in obscurity. If you've never read him, please do. Here's one of my favourite pieces of science fiction. And what's interesting about this book in terms of popular culture and the zeitgeist is that this is one of those books that people often say they've read when they haven't, or it's a book that gets referenced a lot and people don't really understand it because they haven't read it. Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes is an incredible book, and when I realised it had that kind of a legend surrounding it, it's one of those books that nobody's read, I went out and I read it several years ago, and it brought me to tears multiple times. This is a beautiful, somber, heartbreaking science fiction drama. It tells the story of a man called Charlie who is not intelligent at all. He struggles with day-to-day life because of how stupid he is. And he is the first human test subject for a scientific procedure that can artificially increase a person's intelligence. And Charlie, throughout the novel, gradually gets smarter and smarter and smarter. And we watch the consequences of that. The way it changes his life, the way it changes his relationships, his understanding of the world, his work, his friendships. And it's all written in an epistolary style. This is just his diary. As he gets smarter, his grammar develops, his vocabulary broadens, and so the style of the writing shifts as the book goes on. This is such a beautiful book. I think it's time for a reread. I've only read this book once, and Flowers for Algernon is such a powerful, beautiful novel. Since I have an obsession with the Gothic, I can't not talk about one of the great Gothic novels. So let's talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The Gothic saw its golden age in the 19th century, but the 20th century also saw a lot of great Gothic authors, including Daphne du Maurier and her kind of American equivalent, Shirley Jackson. And Rebecca is easily du Maurier's most famous book, her most cherished book. Everyone's read and everyone loves Rebecca, and rightly so. It's a masterpiece of the Gothic. The whole novel is told from the perspective of a nameless woman who is to be the second wife of a man called Max de Winter. De Winter was married before to the titular Rebecca, but Rebecca died before the events of this novel. This book is named after someone who is already dead, but she metaphorically haunts De Winter's home. Her essence remains in everything. She had such an enormous effect on the house, on her husband, and on the staff of this big Gothic country manor that she lived in. And our protagonist has to live in that shadow. She is jealous of a dead woman. But there are a lot of secrets to unveil when it comes to Rebecca and her relationship to Max de Winter. It's an incredible Gothic book that is very much about ghosts and haunting without there being any actual ghosts. This is not a haunted house story, but it is a story about a house that is haunted by memories, by events, by people who are no longer with us. Very, very clever, very beautiful, very captivating, and it has one of the most famous opening lines in all of literature. A lot of my favorite 20th century novels are Japanese, and so I could have just picked a top 10 Japanese books of the 20th century. There are so many greats. But I decided to talk about the Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki, and the reason being is that I don't talk about this book. I don't talk about Tanizaki at all. And I really should. I could have picked a book by Yasunari Kawabata, Kenzaburo Oe, or Osamu Dazai, but I didn't. I've picked this. If you know anything about this book but you haven't read it, you've probably heard it compared to some of the Russian masters of the 19th century, or even to Jane Austen, because this is a family drama, and it's also a pretty hefty book. Tanizaki was a man who very much had kind of a poet's soul. He felt a lot. A lot like Yasunari Kawabata, he was one of those Japanese authors of his time that felt so much joy and happiness and sorrow and disappointment. He was very much an author who captured emotion. And this, as I said, is a family drama. It was published during World War II, and it's set in the years leading up to it, with World War II as a kind of shadow in the background. And the titular Makioka family are a rich, large family in the Kansai area, and the book is set in Osaka. There are 3 daughters of the Makioka family. The 2 eldest daughters have already been married off, and a lot hinges on the successful marriage of the 3rd sister, Yukiko. This is a book about class divides, about societal shifts, about the way that war is changing things, about the fact that Japan has gone through so many social shifts thanks to industrialization and American influence, and we're watching a wealthy family move through all of that. This book is gorgeous. Tanizaki is an amazing writer. I recommend everything he's written. I also, in a similar vein, recommend Yasunari Kawabata and Kenzaburo Oe. All 3 of these writers are just incredible. But the Makioka Sisters is something else. Very political, very socially led, and a very, very satisfying family drama. Octavia Butler is one of the great legends of 20th century literature, and I'm happy to confess that I didn't read her until recently. And to many, Kindred is her magnum opus. This was her great masterpiece. It is a racially charged piece of fairly unique science fiction. It's set in 2 different time periods. The 1970s in California, and 1815 on a plantation in Maryland. Our protagonist is a Black American woman named Dana. She lives a comfortable middle-class life with her husband, but one day she is thrown back in time. She arrives in 1815 and she immediately sees a young white boy drowning in a lake, and she rescues him. But then suddenly, she's looking down the barrel of a gun, and it turns out that this young boy is actually one of her ancestors. He will go on to have a child with one of his slaves on his father's plantation, and about 150 years later, Dana will exist. This is a book about Dana being thrown back in time every single time this white ancestor of hers is in danger. She needs to keep him alive. She's responsible for him for some reason. This is an amazing book about racism, about the history of racism throughout the US. And it's also a piece of science fiction that's like nothing you've ever read. Kindred is a powerful book that encourages you to offer sympathy in ways that you wouldn't normally expect to, or be asked to. I've made a separate video about it if you want to know more, but Kindred really is as great as everyone says, an absolute masterpiece of the 20th century. There were so many powerful anti-something books of the 20th century. Anti-war novels like Slaughterhouse-Five, masterpieces of feminist writing like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. But as someone who values art and literature over almost everything, I want to talk about Fahrenheit 451. This novel by Ray Bradbury did a lot for me when it came to my appreciation of literature and art. It's a dystopian novel where books are banned, and a fireman is not someone who puts out fires, but rather someone whose job it is to go to homes or any buildings where there is a suspicion that there might be books and burn it down. Our protagonist is a fireman. He goes to a house and he finds out that the woman who lives there has been hoarding books, and he burns it all down. But at the last moment, a book catches his eye, and temptation takes over, and he takes that book and he keeps it, and he reads it. And all of his ideas, all of his thoughts and feelings, they all start to change. He questions everything he ever thought he knew about information, about art, about literature, about knowledge. It's a book about fascism, about the fact that when fascism is on the rise, one of the first groups to be targeted are always the academics, teachers and professors, people with degrees, people with knowledge, people who see through what's happening. It's one of the first signs of fascism, and Fahrenheit 451 explores that in such an incredibly powerful way. It's a very on-the-nose book, but a good dystopian book shouldn't hide its metaphor. You should know what it's doing in case you miss the point. And Fahrenheit 451 is absolutely that. From one dystopian novel to another, here's 1984. I couldn't make this list and not talk about George Orwell's 1984, the great dystopian novel. Much like Rebecca, this is a book that starts off with a very, very famous line. And from there, it tells the story of a dystopian future where Britain is the 51st state of the US, and it is controlled by this shadowy oligarchy who hide behind the image of something called Big Brother. They have cameras in every home, eyeballs everywhere, and they twist the news to their liking. They change narratives, they change language to make sure that people toe the line. This book is about a revolution against all of that. A man named Winston who eventually figures out and catches on to a way to stop this, rebel against it, fight against it, and hopefully triumph. 1984 isn't the strongest narrative in the world, but it presents the reader with a list of things to look out for. It breaks down the barriers of fascism and control and offers us a way to see through all of that. It gives us the wisdom and the tools to recognize when your nation is in danger of fascistic control. And for that, 1984 is invaluable. Another genre that absolutely exploded in the 20th century is fantasy. So many of the great fantasy books that have ever been written were written in the 20th century. The genre was invented in that century. And one of its inventors, obviously, was J.R.R. Tolkien. So let's talk about The Hobbit. This was his first book. This is the book that introduces us to Middle-earth. It's also a children's book that is so beloved by adults as well. It is an undeniably beautiful, exciting adventure story that introduces us to a wonderful world inspired by European mythology, folk tales, and geography. Everyone knows the story of The Hobbit. I don't need to relay it to you, but just think about what it must have been like to not have fantasy as a genre. Fantasy was, as I said, inspired by mythology, inspired by folk tales and myths and legends, as well as religion. But that's what was there before. And then thanks to Tolkien, we have fantasy. We have authors creating entire worlds for us to escape into. And The Hobbit was the beginning of all of that. I think that's absolutely incredible to think about. The fact that it started with an adventure story about a tiny little man, a wizard, a group of dwarves, and a mountain in which lives an enormous dragon that hoards gold from people. That's it. That's how all of fantasy began. It's so cool. Finally, Let's talk about Dune. Dune is a colossal work of science fiction. It is a book that is so much smarter than people often think it is. It's a lot smarter than I am. It's a book that subverts chosen one narratives. It's a book that blends fantasy and science fiction. It's a book inspired by empire, inspired by religious traditions, a book about gender roles, a book about fate and prophecies and untrustworthy narratives, a book about war and empire. So many things are explored in Dune. And people are rediscovering Dune or discovering it for the first time thanks to Denis Villeneuve's films. And that's awesome to see. Dune really is something else. You have science fiction that is allegorical. You have spacefaring space operas that are just full of fun adventure, Star Wars style science fiction. And then you have this, science fiction that, as I said, incorporates fantasy and mythology, that looks at the trends and tropes of those genres and very, very cleverly subverts them in an almost underhanded way. It's an enormous space opera that's also one of the smartest pieces of science fiction you'll ever read. There is nothing like Dune. A really incredible novel. And, as a side note, you are spoiled for choice when it comes to covers. There are 100 different cool physical copies of Dune with different covers. This one's pretty great. There you go. Those were 10 must-read modern classics of the 20th century. I tried to spread myself across a few different genres. I tried to talk about books in translation, but I also just wanted to talk about my favourites. So you can enjoy a bit of gothic, a bit of sci-fi, a bit of fantasy, and some of the greatest literary novels that were ever written. I hope you liked it, and subscribe for books.